The auctioneer sold me 19 acres of mud for $27. And the room laughed. 8 months later, two of the same men who laughed were standing in my barn, asking if I would lease them the harvest rights. I was 68 years old that winter, and I had no business buying land. Not the way other men meant land. I did not have money for lime. I did not have money for seed. I did not have a son waiting to take over, or a banker willing to pretend my numbers still made sense. What I had was a tax sale notice folded in my coat pocket, and a memory my mother had given me 40 years earlier. The sale happened on the back steps of the courthouse in Callaway County, Missouri, on a gray Friday in February of 2001. The kind of cold that makes every man stamp his boots, even when he is trying not to look cold. The parcel was listed as 19.3 acres on Old Sinking Creek Road. No house, no barn, no well, no septic approval, no crop history worth writing down. The county map showed it as pasture. But that was generous. It was a bowl of black water, cattails, willow scrub, and one crooked gravel entrance that disappeared after a hard rain. It had been forfeited for unpaid taxes twice in 6 years. The last owner had tried to plant soybeans on the higher edge and lost the tractor to the mud before Memorial Day. So when the bidding opened at $50, nobody moved. The auctioneer looked over the crowd and said, "Gentlemen, it is still land." A man behind me said, "Barely." The auctioneer dropped it to 30. Nothing. Then he said, mostly to clear the paper, "Who gives me 25? I raised my hand. You could feel the whole courthouse step turn toward me. A seed dealer named Roy Beeman grinned and said, "Eli, you planning to drown corn now?" I said, "Not corn." That made them laugh harder. The auctioneer gave me the deed for $27 after recording fees. I paid with a 20, a 5, and 2 wrinkled singles. He handed me the receipt like he was handing a doctor bad news. Roy leaned close as I folded the deed. "What exactly did you buy?" I looked at the map number. Then I looked at the gray ditch water running along the road. I bought what nobody wanted to bend down and look at. That afternoon, I drove out there in my old Dodge with a feed sack, a garden fork, and the same pair of rubber boots I used for cleaning the hog pen back when I still had hogs. The road was worse than the county description. Ice in the ruts, standing water over the low places, willow branches scratching both doors of the truck. I walked in because driving would have been foolish, and at my age, you learn the difference between courage and paying for a tow. The cattails were everywhere, not a few by the ditch, not a patch around the bank. A field of them. Brown heads standing above the ice. Dead leaves rattling in the wind. Stalks packed so tight in places that a rabbit would have had to turn sideways. Most people see cattails and think one word: swamp. My mother saw bread. She grew up in the winter after the river took their corn crib, when my grandfather worked WPA ditch jobs for 50 cents a day and came home with his gloves frozen around the handle of a shovel. She told me that when the flour barrel got low, her mother sent the children to the marsh with gunny sacks. They pulled cattail rhizomes from the mud. Not roots exactly, rhizomes. Thick underground stems, pale inside, full of starch. They washed them in a creek, scraped them, dried them near the stove, and pounded them into meal. It was not pretty food, but it was food. The young shoots could be cooked like leeks. The pollen could stretch flour. The brown seed heads held a silky down that people once stuffed into pillows and life jackets when cotton and kapok were short. My mother used to say, "A wet field will feed you if you stop asking it to act dry." I had not thought about that sentence in years. Standing in that frozen marsh with water creeping over my boot tops, I bent down and dug at the base of the nearest cattail clump. The fork hit something firm. I pried, pulled with both hands, and brought up a mud-black chain of rhizomes as long as my forearm. I broke one open, cream white inside, clean, starchy, still alive under all that February deadness. That was when the laughter from the courthouse stopped sounding like laughter. It started sounding like a price. I took a feed sack of rhizomes home and laid them on the kitchen table. I cut one into coins, boiled it, and tasted it with salt. Fibrous, sweet at the edges, earthy in the middle. Not something a man would put on a white tablecloth, but not worthless. The next morning, I went to the public library in Fulton and started with everything they had under wetlands, edible wild plants, and fiber crops. Most of it was thin. Survival manuals, old extension sheets, a 1943 war bulletin about natural flotation material. One university paper said broadleaf cattail, Typha latifolia, could produce starch, pollen, shoots, and fiber from the same stand if harvested at the right times. That mattered. A crop with one use is a gamble. A crop with 4 uses is a system. Food was the obvious thought, but obvious does not always pay. Restaurants need clean packing. Grocers need consistency. Food laws can bury a man before the first check clears. So I looked at the down. By the 3rd day, I found a trade magazine at the extension office with a short article about companies testing plant fiber for biodegradable packing, insulation blends, and oil-absorbent pads. Milkweed, quinaf, cattail, anything light, hollow, and dry enough to trap air. I asked the extension agent if he knew anyone buying cattail fiber. He looked at me over his glasses and said, "You have cattails?" "I have 19 acres of the county's worst decision." He smiled at that, but not like Roy Beeman smiled. This was the smile of a man hearing a problem turned sideways. He wrote down a number for a small materials company in Duluth. They made absorbent booms for machine shops in marinas, and they were looking for natural fiber that would not arrive full of stems, bugs, and rainwater. I called from my kitchen wall phone that evening. A woman named Claire answered. I told her I had standing cattail, clean enough water, no chemical runoff that I knew of, and the patience to strip it right. She did not laugh. She asked, "How dry can you get it?" I said, "Tell me how dry it has to be." She said, "Under 12% moisture, under 8% stem contamination. Send 5 pounds if you can." I did not tell her I had never measured moisture in my life. I hung up, drove to the co-op, and bought a used hay moisture meter for $18 and a roll of mesh screen for $6. For the next week, I worked in the marsh from daylight until my hands got too stiff to close. I cut the seed heads, hung them in the machine shed, and blew air through them with an old squirrel cage fan I had pulled out of a furnace 20 years before. The first batch was a mess, too many broken stems, too much leaf trash, too damp in the middle. I lost 3 days learning that cattail down behaves like smoke once it is loose. It sticks to your coat, your eyebrows, the rafters, the dog if he walks too close. Then I remembered the hand-crank apple scratter my uncle had used for cider. It had 2 rough rollers and an adjustable gap. I cleaned it, widened the teeth with a file, and fed a dried cattail head through. The rollers grabbed the core, crushed it, and let the down fall into a flour sack. Not perfect, but close. I ran the fiber through a window screen twice, weighed 5 pounds on a kitchen scale, packed it in a cardboard box, and mailed it north. At the post office, the clerk asked what was inside. Cattail down. She held the box like it might hatch. 2 weeks passed. I kept cutting, drying, stripping, screening. By then, I had 31 pounds stacked in the shed, light as smoke and twice as hard to keep in a bag. Roy Beeman came by one morning and found me with cattail fuzz up to my elbows. He stood in the doorway and said, "Eli, I have seen men go broke on corn, cattle, hogs, and divorce. But I believe you are the first man I know going broke on weeds." I said, "These weeds do not need nitrogen." He said, "They do not need brains either." I let him have that one. The phone rang on the 15th day. It was Claire from Duluth. She said the fiber tested at 9.4% moisture and 5.7% contamination. Better than 2 of the commercial samples they had bought that spring. Then she asked if I could deliver 150 pounds within 45 days, at $3.75 a pound. I wrote the number on an envelope because my hand had gone stupid. $562.50. From the marsh, everybody had refused at 50. I told her yes before I had any idea how yes was going to happen. That is when the marsh quit being a curiosity and became a clock. 150 pounds did not sound like much until you learned how little each head gave you after drying and cleaning. I needed thousands of stalks. I needed dry days. I needed the fan not to burn out. I needed my back to keep its opinion to itself. I marked the first section with survey ribbon and worked it in lanes so I would not strip the same ground twice. I cut only mature heads. I left young growth alone. I stayed out of the channel where the water moved clear because I was not trying to ruin the only reason the plants were healthy. By mid-March, the weather turned mean. 3 inches of rain in 2 days. The creek climbed the bank. The old gravel entrance disappeared under brown water, and half my drying racks tipped over when the shed roof leaked where I had patched it with feed signs. I lost 17 pounds in one night. Wet fiber sours fast. It clumps. It heats. It smells like a mouse nest in a rain barrel. I spread what I could save across every screen, ladder, and spare door in the shed. I ran the fan until the belt smoked. I put a kerosene heater near the north wall and watched it like a prison guard. That was the darkest week. Not because of the work. Work I understood. It was the little voice that came after the work, when the shed was quiet and my hands were cracked open from cold water. The voice said, maybe they were right. Maybe worthless is worthless. Maybe an old memory is not a business plan. Then I found the cigar box. It was in the bottom drawer of my mother's old dresser, under war ration books and a photograph of her standing barefoot beside a mule. I had been looking for twine. Instead, I found a folded page from my grandfather's ledger. No story, no explanation, just a few lines in pencil. South Slough, leave wet. Cattail stands strongest after flood. Cut heads in winter. Dig white stems before bloom. Do not drain. The last line was underlined twice. Do not drain. I sat on the edge of the bed with that paper in my hands and understood something I should have known earlier. The land had not become useful when I bought it. It had been useful all along. We were the ones who had changed the definition. After that, I stopped trying to make the marsh look like a farm. I made the farm fit the marsh. I raised the drying racks on blocks. I put gutters on the shed and ran the downspouts into barrels. I built a screen box from scrap lumber so the fiber could be cleaned without blowing across the whole county. I cut a narrow footpath on high ground and left the wettest middle alone. By the deadline, I had 163 pounds. I drove north in my Dodge with fiber sacks tied under a tarp and the heater stuck on high because the vent cable had broken in 1994. Claire met me at the loading bay herself. They weighed every sack, tested 3, checked moisture with a probe that looked fancier than my truck. Then she came back with a purchase order for the full amount, $611.25. She also gave me a second order, 400 pounds by late summer if the quality held. I remember standing there on the loading dock with that paper in my hand, trying not to look like I had never held a purchase order before. On the drive home, I stopped at a diner outside Hannibal and ate meatloaf with the order folded in my shirt pocket. For the first time in years, I chewed slow. Spring changed the whole business. The brown heads were mostly done, but the young shoots came in clean and green along the shallow edges. I cut a bucketful, trimmed them, and carried them to a Vietnamese grocer in Colombia whose nephew bought local greens for restaurants. He split one shoot with his thumbnail, smelled it, and said, "How many pounds?" I said, "How many can you use?" That question made both of us careful. We started at 50 pounds a week, then 80, then 120, when the chefs figured out what they were. They wanted the pale hearts, not the woody outer leaves. Clean, cold, bundled, no mud in the boxes. It was not big money, but it was steady money. 70 cents a pound at first, then 85 for trimmed hearts. The same stand that gave fiber in winter gave vegetables in spring. The rhizomes could be dug in the fall for starch buyers if I left enough to regrow. The pollen in June went to a baker in Jefferson City who blended it into specialty flour and paid more for one jar than I used to get for a bushel of feed corn. By August, I had a ledger again. Not a fancy one, a black and white composition book from the dollar store. Date, weather, section cut, pounds green, pounds dry, buyer, check number. I wrote everything down because memory is useful, but numbers keep a man honest. By September, the marsh had paid back the deed, the fan, the meter, the screen, the gas to Duluth, and the roof patch. By October, it paid the property tax on my home place. By December, it paid the note on the baler I had not used in 3 seasons but could not afford to lose. Roy came by after the first freeze. He did not laugh that time. He stood in my shed looking at the sacks of clean fibers stacked up to the window line. He rubbed a pinch between his fingers and watched it spring back. "What are they using it for?" he asked. "Keeping oil out of water," I said. "Keeping glass from breaking. Keeping heat where it belongs." He looked past me toward the cattails, brown and stiff in the cold. "All that from that mud?" "No," I said, "from knowing what the mud was for." He offered me $500 for half interest in the next harvest. I told him no. The second year, I cleared the willow from 2 higher pockets and let the sunlight hit the water. The cattails filled the openings without asking permission. I did not plant, I did not drain, I did not fertilize. I only cut what the stand could spare and kept the lanes clean. That year, I sold 1,200 pounds of dry fiber at $4.10 a pound. I sold just over 2,000 pounds of shoots and rhizomes to 3 buyers. I sold pollen in jars so small they looked like medicine. After expenses, the marsh netted a little over $7,000. Not a fortune, but when you are old and the bank knows your voice too well, $7,000 from land nobody wanted feels like a door opening in a wall. People started calling it luck. That bothered me more than the laughing. Luck is finding money in a coat. This was not luck. This was my mother remembering her mother. My grandfather writing one sentence in a ledger. A plant doing exactly what it had always done. And one old man finally asking the right question. The question was never, "How do I make this wet ground useful?" The question was, what use was already here before I tried to improve it? There is a difference. Improvement can be arrogance with a tractor. Understanding is quieter. It kneels down. It breaks open a stem. It listens to the people who survived before convenience taught everyone to forget. I still own that marsh. I still walk it in winter when the cattails rattle like paper bones and the creek slides black under the ice. I do not move fast anymore. I do not cut as much. A neighbor's daughter helps with the heavy work now, and I pay her better than anyone paid me at her age. Sometimes she asks why I never sold it when the offers came. I tell her the truth. Some land does not need to be rescued. Some land is a locked pantry, waiting for someone old enough, hungry enough, or humble enough to remember where the key was hidden. And when everyone else calls it worthless, that does not mean it has no value. It may only mean the value is speaking a language they forgot.